ink, and then it gives the live bink. So now we're actually streaming live. This is in the recording. This is what people tune in for. All right. You guys ready?
Prime stuff. The cream of the crop.
I'm so pleased, by the way, that I'm finally figured out a good way to multi-track this stuff.
Oh, yeah.
That's hot.
Just needed to turn things up a little bit. There we go. Is this better? You were saying something about my levels earlier.
This sounds more like the Dave I'm used to.
Yeah.
All right. We look a little more even in Audition now, too. All right.
Cool.
Here we go.
Right.
So that when I'm doing the 3, 2, 1, I'm hoping that it's going to be quiet during those, which is why I'm not actually saying them. And it was like the loudest part of the whole morning so far.
Sorry, I wasn't looking at the screen.
There was some table pounding, and then there was some coffee slurping. It was amazing.
I'm watching you this time.
We're going to go me, and then Sam, and then Nate. This is SoundNotion, the podcast for new music and music news. I'm David McDonald.
I'm Sam Merciers.
And I'm Nate Blyton.
And this week on the less than usually weekly show, we've got a bunch of really interesting stories for you and a discussion story that we have been reading about for a little while. This is a couple of weeks ago, but a few other people have responded to it, and we think it's going to be really interesting about the relationship between composers and performers. But first, I want to start with some news about concert music and new music that might have even been in a regular magazine this week. Are you guys ready for this?
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't know if you've heard of this young lady, Taylor Swift, I believe is her name. Have you heard of this young lady? She seems very nice. But she decided to make a rather sizable gift to the Seattle Symphony Orchestra because she was so enamored of their recording of John Luther Adams' Become Ocean, which, of course, as we know, is the Pulitzer Prize-winning piece from 2014. And actually, coincidentally, as we were recording this, I heard performed live last night by the New World Symphony. But Tay-Tay gave $50K to the Seattle Symphony because she liked it so much. I did not give quite that much money to the New World Symphony.
Gave $21.50 or whatever it was.
Right. I gave at least the cost of one ticket and possibly parking.
Yeah, it's interesting to me to see how many people go, oh, that's so awesome that Taylor Swift gave that money, and then I would like to explain to those people how little $50,000 means in the scale of an entity like the Seattle Symphony. Certainly, it doesn't hurt. We all know.
Yeah,
but I disagree. I think it's a pretty significant amount for any performing arts organization.
I'm sure it certainly makes a difference. And so I actually went to a party last night with some symphony folks, and they reminded me that this is not actually unusual for Taylor Swift to do this kind of thing.
Yeah, in 2013, right? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, she gave $100,000 to the Nashville Symphony. And apparently, she's scaling it back a little bit for Seattle, I guess. I don't know, but
well, that's like her hometown orchestra, I would think.
Yeah.
Right? And this is just like a thing that she heard on a record and said, "Hey, that was neat. Here's some money."
Because remember, Taylor Swift used to be a country star.
Well, so along those lines, she gave $4 million to the Country Music Hall of Fame in 2012, and has done all kinds of things for children's books, and I think there's a cancer, or it was like the son or something or nephew of a dancer. She's helping support her cancer treatment and stuff. And so her philanthropic adventures have been long lasting, and it's pretty impressive.
That's good. It's good, and you guys want to feel terrible? She's 25,
right?
And she can afford to donate $4 million to somebody.
Yeah, I don't know if I like anybody that much. I mean, I certainly have $4 million. I just don't really have anybody that I like enough to give it to them. Maybe Sam, if you play your cards right.
If you could donate $4 million to some entity, who would you donate it to?
Oh, I don't know.
Yeah.
Probably a university music department.
I would
'Cause I
think
like
alma maters.
Yeah.
I would pay to give MSU a new performance hall.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely a nice thing for somebody so high profile in the music world to give something to
I'm
cross
interested
over
that
to
it is the
cross
new
over.
music, though, that caused this. It's not that she heard a recording of Beethoven. It's that she heard a recording, a premiere recording of a brand new piece by a living composer.
Yeah, but
So
it's a very soft, fuzzy, easy to listen to new piece.
I would also argue pretty easy to fall asleep to.
Yeah, it's not a sharp and pointy new piece. Yeah, it is pretty easy to fall asleep to.
Yeah, well, let's wait a little longer. Maybe she'll give something for a really, really pointy piece.
Yeah, I'm
Maybe-
sure she's going to see Lulu.
She just hasn't heard any Milton Babbitt yet. She hasn't heard Uncle Milty's stuff. That's the problem.
There you go. I think we should, that's the next step. I expect that her next major donation will be to the Ensemble into Contemporain or something like that.
There you go.
Cool.
So that's not the only news that is related to the pop music world this week. Sam tells us of his new favorite Hall of Fame and museum opening in Harlem this week.
Well, it's not opening. They've launched a fundraising campaign, and it will be, I think it was 2017 is when it's, hold on.
Scheduled to open.
It'll open
January.
late in 2016. They've secured ownership of the building where it's going to be.
Cool.
And this has been in plan. Like, I found stories for it going back a year, but now, like, things are official. The grounds have been purchased, and the process is actually starting for the hip hop music and culture. What is it actually called? Hip Hop Hall of Fame and Museum. It's going to open in Harlem, which is perfectly fitting, I think. And
Do you think
yeah.
there is a? Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, do you think that there is like a point of jumping the shark or something of like starting to turn old when something is old enough to have a Hall of Fame and museum dedicated to it?
Yeah, I don't know.
This is an indication that maybe we're kind of starting to round off the canon of historical hip hop now.
I think so.
We're now looking for something new.
I absolutely think so. I think that anytime that an art form or any kind of movement becomes institutionalized, suffice to say that hip-hop, any genre of hip-hop music, is not absolutely studyable in college everywhere, but I'm sure that you can study both the history of it and the practice of it at lots of universities. Just the way jazz is now. I mean, any school that's big enough to call itself a big school with a big music program has a jazz department, and that has
Jazz has about a 100-year head start.
Yeah, but things move faster now. Like, things become enshrined and become history faster because of communication technology, I think, and we can easily collect the canon and have access to it and feel like it's a canon because it's so easy to collect it and think of it as this collection of pieces because we can get our hands on them immediately.
Well, and the canon of hip-hop is much more quantifiable than the canon of jazz because it's a canon of recordings for the most part.
Right.
Interesting. We just had a little Marshall McLuhan moment there for you, Sam.
Yeah, my favorite. So anyway, I would love to visit it when it's up and going. We'll have to get our man on the street, Patrick Gulo, to jump back on board long enough to go by and give us a walkthrough tour.
So
on to from New York to the most natural place to go next if you're interested in music, right?
Louisville, Kentucky.
Louisville. I was discussing earlier today before we came on air. How is it that I'm sure there's a story I can find the answer, but it's just surprising that the University of Louisville, is that what it is? University of Louisville gives this award for 100,000 bones, and they do it every year.
It has a lot to do with someone named Graumeyer.
Yeah. Well, of course. I mean, some person gave it a big endowment that you got to realize. I mean, for them to be able to fork over $100,000, this is yearly, correct?
Yeah.
For them
So
to do
what
that, the
Sam is
endowment
talking
has to
about
be gigantic.
What Sam is talking about is the Graumeyer Prize was announced recently, and it is going to Hans Abramson for an orchestral song cycle called "Let Me Tell You" for soprano and orchestra. Hans Abramson is a Danish composer, and "Let Me Tell You" is based on a novel by Paul Griffiths, also called "Let Me Tell You." Which is constructed from is it Ophelia's
Yeah.
writings in Hamlet
Hmm.
to tell her kind of personal story, to tell essentially the story of Hamlet from Ophelia's perspective. Um, and this is the main text for this long song cycle, which is very cool. And we can hear some of Abrahamson's music. We'll have links to some of that stuff in our show notes. But congratulations to Hans Abramson.
Yeah. And it's really interesting that he hasn't written. He dabbled, as the article says, with writing vocal music in the 1970s, but this is his first real outing writing vocal music. So
It's
I
smart.
guess he's got a knack for it, maybe.
It's hard to do.
Yeah,
Maybe he should write some more of it.
Mhm.
I think that would be good. Hey, speaking of hearing Shakespearean stories from different perspectives, have you ever seen the movie or read the play or seen the play of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead?
Ooh.
Yes.
It's
There's
favorite.
a Gary Oldman and Tim Roth play the roles in the movie. Really good.
Mhm.
Yes. Good story. Good story.
Yeah, good story.
Cool,
So
cool
good.
story, bro.
Mm.
So
Uh,
let's move. Speaking of speaking of singing, singing played a prominent role in this article that we read this week by Alex Gardner, or sorry, not Alex Gardner, Alex Temple, the other Alex at New Music Box, and this is a really interesting essay about the relationship between composers and performers and the extent to which composers are kind of basically treating performers as these musical automatons that do not get to have a lot of say in the music that they perform, nor do they have a lot of really control over what I don't want to put words in Alex's mouth, but maybe some exploitation, and specifically some really clear opportunities at failure or harm to their instrument or whatnot through performing these works. Um, she discusses this in the context of a few different conversations that she had with other composers who sometimes we talk to composers on this show who say that they want their scores to be executed relatively faithfully, and we talk to other composers who are somewhat, to use a somewhat loaded term, blasé about the precision to which their scores are executed by performers, and they want performers to add a lot of stuff to the piece itself. And I feel like a lot of composers fall into that second category, but everybody has their own little uh, their own piece of the music that they think is the important key part, and the other parts of it are the things that they can be flexible on. But because whatever that key part is different for each composer, or really each piece, the performer has to treat it all like it's the gospel truth and doesn't know what parts of it can be a little bit more flexible. So I don't know. What did you guys think about when you were reading this piece?
well, when she tries to flip the conversation and make how you as a composer treat performers into a social justice issue, I don't know. It just seems a little too much of a stretch for me. I mean, there's a framework around the relationship that you as a composer have with performers, and unless you're a composer who is somehow writing for children's choirs and they don't have a choice and they're having to sing your pieces or something like that, unless you're physically exploiting some at-risk group that way, I don't think that it gets to the level of being a social justice issue. I think it gets to the level of you either are or aren't an asshole sometimes as a composer, but it's not a social justice issue.
And which are you?
I am. I was thinking about this a lot, and she uses two composers. There's Stravinsky, who says that scores shouldn't be interpreted; they should be realized as an objective musical text. Mm-hmm. And then there's another person in there that she uses as the juxtaposition to that, where I can't remember the name, but lots of interpretation sort of baked into the way the score presents itself to the composer. I mean, to the performer. I'm more of the Stravinskyan model. Like, I have very specific tempi and very specific rhythms and very specific dynamic changes, and I want it all followed as accurately as possible.
Yeah, I've talked to you about this before, and I've heard you describe your music as, to use the 90s Windows marketing term, plug and play.
Yeah.
Right? I've heard you describe your music using those words because what you are saying oftentimes is that the performers have to trust that you have taken this stuff into account and that the other performers are doing the same thing.
Yes.
With their parts, and if everybody is executing their parts as basically computer code, literally and very,
accurately
oriented and precisely, then the music will just happen.
Yes, and I'm not saying that it's that way 100% in every situation, but I've been in situations where I can't convince people that I guess I know what I'm doing and that I wrote all the indications in the score on purpose. And you end up getting a performance that I'm not necessarily so happy with. And then I've seen people who, at first, couldn't make sense of the music, but if they trust me and just try to play it, it starts to click with the other players in the ensemble, and all of a sudden they're like, oh, okay, I see what's happening here. Yeah. That trust that I do, in fact, know what I'm doing is something that seems to be lacking sometimes. And when you're talking about performers who spend a lot of time interpreting canon pieces that have varying degrees of sort of freedom baked into the performance practice of the piece and the time it was written, it's hard to convince performers sometimes that if you just faithfully execute what I've got down there, at least as a starting point, the music will happen, and then you figure out how you can flex your agency inside that framework, right?
Mm-hmm. So in the article, Alex uses as an example a composer who has a device that is actually hurting the soprano for whom they're writing or that's performing it. And you talk about how, like, in your music, you know what you're doing, and you're also not hurting people.
That's true.
And part of knowing what you're doing is, I imagine, writing things that don't like injure the people that are performing it. And I think with voice it's different than with other instruments because like everybody's different, and I'm sure there's stuff you could do on a violin that if you don't do it right you could injure yourself.
But probably far less likely.
Hurt the violin, right? I mean, a lot of violinists have their separate colegno bow, right?
Yeah. But if you wrote like up here in the top position somewhere, and you wrote 87 measures of that as a background part, that would be kind of ridiculous and could inspire carpal tunnel or something in a string player.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
cause RSI through your background string parts.
Or like doing an interval for which you just have to stretch so much, and like I just the strings are my world, and so I'm relating it to something that I know, like for the most part, people give the reasoning that like you either can do that or you can't. But in this case, it would be like the composer saying like, so I know you say you can't do it, but you can, and I need you to do it, or the piece is off.
Yeah, well, see, I don't think that I also either write for instruments that I understand in a very idiomatic way. Like I'd say the piece that I've stretched and strained performers on more than anything is my clarinet trio, and I know a clarinet pretty darn well, and I know that I'm not writing anything that's going to hurt anybody. I've written a couple of vocal pieces, and I would badger vocalists endlessly about range and is this too hard and is this too high, and oddly, I found it more difficult. I actually had a similar experience dealing with a lot of student pieces this semester because we had a lot of SATB choir pieces in the studio, and getting singers to give you, and this is young singers, getting them to give you accurate answers to is this too much, because they don't want to say no. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I
So
think maybe
understand.
that's a part of what Alex is writing about
Yeah.
here that's never really explicitly stated, and it goes to something that I think, Sam, you touched on earlier, is that this is not just a one-way relationship when we start to work on a piece, right? If I'm asking somebody to play a piece, if I'm presenting a concert and I'm hiring a musician, I say, hey, can you play this piece? They're going to take a look at it and say yes or no, and they don't have to take the gig. If it's something they aren't comfortable doing, if they don't want to do it, I'm not holding a gun to their head saying this is a thing that you must do on May 3rd or whatever. I'm saying that, do you want this job? This is what the job is playing this
Yeah.
piece.
But
And if you don't want the job, fine. You know.
there are other factors at play. For example, like if I ask some singer, hey, I wrote this piece, would you like to give it a try? They're going to feel way less pressure to say yes and take the gig for any number of reasons than they would if even Alex Temple, who is eminently more famous than me, as in I am 0% famous, and she's some famous, right? And then if you step from her to,
I don't know if fame is the word I would use for any of this.
Her name is known as a composer. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't think fame really touches composers unless you're, winning the Grammire, but you know what I mean. Notoriety, notable composer. Mm-hmm. And if you go from her to John Adams or whatever, the pressure for the performer to say, oh yes, absolutely, sir, is much higher, right? So I think that might be an issue where the composer would want to be careful what they ask for because, as Spider-Man knows, with great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah. I mean, and so that's an example of a personal relationship, like of somebody giving into somebody else because of a power thing. And so in the article, she makes a case about that in terms of gender, and just that she's had so many examples of it being a gender thing. And it's hard to dispute that that's what happened. But in any case, yeah.
Well, I mean, so what I was trying to get at earlier is that when we're establishing these relationships with performers, this is somewhat of an equal a relationship of equals, at least at the beginning, all the time, right? And then something changes to be this more, I don't know, authoritative kind of thing. And Alex Temple in this piece uses one of Sam's favorite words, agency, quite a bit, and how much agency a performer has over the composition in the realization of the piece. And I don't know how much, Sam, you're shaking your head. I don't know how much agency is appropriate to give the performer and still have the composer. I mean, there's obviously a wide spectrum of how much control the performer gets in the piece. And, at one end of the spectrum is kind of what Sam was describing earlier with his relationships with performers. And at the other end of the spectrum is something where there's no composer at all, and it's freely improvised from the get-go. And I wonder if that's something that needs to be considered. Is does this change the kind of music that we're doing? Is it a fundamentally different thing if it's not created by a composer and is instead created by a performer? I think that's an interesting thing. One thing that I did also want to add, we've talked about a little bit on the show before, the kind of hand sign language of sound painting, which is this gestural conducting language for structuring group improvisations created by Walter Thompson. And he's got several books that you can check out at soundpainting.org. But there are all these gestures, and like the main thing in these books is just a vocabulary of like, you do this gesture and it means a long tone, you do this gesture it means you're talking to the string section, you do this gesture it means you play soft, whatever. And through this whole thing, there's one gesture that the performer is given right off the bat, and that's, I can't do that, or that this is not good for me, like I can't do this anymore, whatever you're gesturing for me to do, I can't do. And I think that's an interesting thing, is that there is that point of acknowledgement that this is not a totalitarian, authoritative relationship.
Right.
And I think that's valuable.
At the end of the piece, near the end of the piece, she actually addresses that issue, and I think in a funny way. She equates it to kink culture. In other words, you're surrendering something to someone else, but you've got to have trust. And this brings up a show title: New Music Safe Word. That's what you need. Is a new music safe word.
So, in fact, I think that was a show title a long time ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah, safe word.
Let me try another. So, I like that gesture sounds like performer veto or whatever. Yeah, they get veto power.
It's like it's almost like an international choking sign, as I recall.
Oh.
It's like I am choking on your quintuplets or whatever.
There we go. Choking
it's a
on your
gag.
quintuplets.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I do like this idea though, and I think it is important for us to consider that we're working, and this is something that I talk about all the time because I teach classes online, and when you are removed from the person that you're actually interacting with in physical space or whatever, that when you are sitting, writing music, you're in a room by yourself. You're not with the person who's going to perform it. When you are interacting with a student or a teacher online, they're not in the room with you, and they're going to read this thing at another time, many hours or days after you write it. And it's actually, it takes some mental, I don't know, proactiveness to make sure that you are always thinking of that as another person, because it's very easy for you to think of just making symbols on a page or making letters on a computer screen or whatever, but there is another person that is at the other end of that. And I think that's the thing that we always have to remember when we're writing for people, is that we're not writing for music robots. We're writing for performers who are humans. And I think that's really easy to forget when we're so abstracted in space and time from the people that are playing our music when we're writing it.
Yeah. I think the whole piece is sort of just addressing the issue of the way collaboration is so much easier for people than it ever has been in the past. From, Skype to the fact that paper is cheap and plentiful. For all kinds of reasons. We can do it more easily than ever before. And this is just sort of addressing the consequences of having music that's more and more typically made through some sort of collaborative effort, rather than just, you get this piece of programming and you put it you put the programming into the computer and get an output, Yeah. Like a score. And this is more like a living, breathing thing that happens between multiple people.
Exactly. And I think it's a wonderful place that we are in the world, and I'm sure this is going to continue to develop in a nice way. Dave, you posed the question of whether it was a fundamentally different thing, like a composer, performer making their own piece for themselves than somebody writing a piece for somebody else. And I feel like that's like along the spectrum of like Sam knowing what he's doing about writing for an instrument, or writing for clarinet, or writing for himself playing clarinet. Like it's just degrees further toward having complete fluency with the music that is being written and being put together.
Yeah.
And I think
I think Sam can write for clarinet bot, but I can't because I don't know clarinet as well as Sam does.
Right.
Yeah. And there's certainly some benefits to that kind of unfamiliarity of like just not necessarily going into the same conventions and stuff. but the fluency is definitely, like, obviously really, really helps with
Yeah.
having successful pieces, rather.
Yeah, except sometimes not knowing the instrument, if you don't put the performer in a situation where they're going to get hurt, can lead to more interesting sounding music. Like, my undergraduate composition teacher told me that the most interesting piano music is written by non-piano players, because it's so easy to fall into standard sort of tropes of piano music. And if you don't know what you're doing in that way, but it's just, a board with a bunch of buttons, and figure out what buttons you want them to push without being sort of immersed in the long canon of the piano music, sometimes yields fresh sounding results.
Mm-hmm. And I don't mean to diminish this point, but in the same way that, like, I play with synthesizer patches or plugins in a computer, and some of the old ones had like a randomize button, just like set all the values to whatever and see what comes out. Yeah, so that there's a case for completely disconnecting from any knowledge of the instrument.
Right.
Yeah, but at the end, you don't use all of the randomized.
Right.
You don't just automatically take whatever randomize does. If you don't like it, you click randomize again.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Use your ears for sure.
Right. So I don't know if we solved any problems there, but I think we had a fun discussion.
I had
Absolutely. Fun. Speaking of fun discussions, we talked about this story last year. It's put out by, I think it's the Boston Orchestra. My mouse, since I upgraded to Windows 10, my mouse doesn't want to move correctly or something. Yeah, the Baltimore Orchestra, put out by the Baltimore Orchestra. Last year they crunched a lot of data on all of the, quote, major U.S. orchestras. Well, this year they've included a whole bunch of regional orchestras, and there's no way we could go over all the data. It shows that a lot of music by dead composers gets performed, as to be expected, and this is not going to be vastly different than what we saw last year, but just to give a few quick headlines. The average date of a piece played at a symphony concert in 2015-16 is 1892. 1,524 different pieces were performed, think about that number, in a total of 3,023 concerts that they looked at. So half of the only half as many pieces were performed as there were concerts. That should give you some information about what kind of pieces are being performed. Living composers, 12% of all pieces that were performed were by living composers.
That's higher than I
what that means is not only is there a lot of overlap, but there are not very many pieces on some of these programs.
Right. All pieces by female composers, which represent less than 2% of the total, are living composers, obviously. The top living composer is John Adams, then John Williams, then I can't really read, Jennifer Higdon, hey, there you go, Mason Bates, Philip Glass. God, these are tiny. Anyway, it's a lot of really cool information. Beethoven, Mozart, Brahms make up more than 18% of all music performed. Piano is the featured soloist at 30% of the time, followed 22% of the time by violin. 9% of the music played this season was written in 2000 or later. So things aren't changing. These look very similar to the numbers we saw last year. But it's interesting. We'll have links in the show notes if you want to dig through some data. It's got it broken down in all kinds of different ways.
Well, that's pretty cool. I like this. I like these kinds of data reports.
Me too.
More of these.
Well, I just happened to find this one because Jennifer Higdon shared it on her Facebook profile this morning.
We should also fix some of those numbers.
Yeah, we should fix those numbers for certain.
Keep working on it, yeah.
Is that going to do it for this week? Oh, Sam, you've got one more.
Yeah, rest in peace, Scott Weiland, a lead singer for Stone Temple Pilots originally, and then what was his band that was big for a while after that, Nate?
The Velvet Revolver.
Velvet Revolver, yeah. They were actually pretty good, too. Really great performer. Lived a whole lot of life in his 48 years on the planet. I didn't. He died in his sleep, and we can all make what we want out of that. But he's well known to have addiction problems, let's say. So, but I was a big fan, especially of Stone Temple Pilots.
Yeah.
The soundtrack of my teenage years.
Of your misspent youth.
My misspent youth, yes. They were
So
actually one
we
of the
will
more.
leave you.
They were one of the more intricately composed bands of the grunge era, I'd say.
We will leave you with thoughts of Sam's misspent youth this week. Thank you so much for listening to the show. You can find links to all the things that we spoke about on our site in the show notes at soundnotion.tv/SN. You can also find links there to connect with us on all the socials. You can find us on Twitter as a group. We're at SoundNotion. I'm at Dave McDowell. Sam is at Housegoing. Nate is at an H-Tree. We're also on Facebook. As you know, Sam is a big fan of the Facebook, and so you can find us there. Just search SoundNotion on Facebook. And we would love to continue these conversations with you about Alex's piece, about hip-hop's crustification, and all of these other stories that we talked about today. Thank you so much for watching or listening, and we will see you back next time.
Burn your wicked garden down.